Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for American Progress. Our program will be starting in just a couple of minutes. Two brief reminders before we begin. First, please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. Second, we will be taking audience questions following the panel discussion. We ask that you wait for the microphone to come to you, state your name and affiliation before your question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for being here today, and welcome to everyone online. I'm Adam Connor. I'm the Vice President for Technology Policy at the Center for American Progress and co-author of the CAP report, How to Regulate Tech, a technology policy framework for online services. CAP is thrilled to welcome everybody here today, both in person and those of us joining online, for an event we are co-hosting with our friends and allies from Public Knowledge, the next wave of technology regulation, the need for new authorities in the US and beyond. A few housekeeping announcements before we begin. For those of you joining us in person, please silence your cell phones to make sure they don't interrupt the proceedings. For those of you joining us online, information should be provided for you on how to submit questions online or access captions, and that should be available on the screen for those of you watching online. We will begin with a panel discussion with leading experts on the need for new forms of technology regulation. And then CAP Executive Vice President for Policy, Mara Rudman, will introduce CAP's newest distinguished senior fellow, Dr. Alondra Nelson, former acting head of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Biden-Harris administration. We will then hear closing remarks from Chris Lewis, the President and CEO of Public Knowledge, our partner in this event. In January, President Biden published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal calling for Congress to take up bipartisan efforts on privacy, children's safety, and tech antitrust, a call that he echoed in his State of the Union address a few days later. This came on the heels of important work in the 117th Congress, where bipartisan legislation on privacy, tech antitrust, and children's safety made important progress, but ultimately, none of those bills became law. Across the Atlantic, the European Union and the United Kingdom are moving swiftly to address digital issues in ways that will have a profound impact on the US tech sector. The EU's Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, the DSA and DMA respectively, are now laws that are being implemented as we speak and will have a profound impact on existing online services and mean those in the EU will have more protections online than those of us here in the US very soon. Most of the speakers here today are strong proponents of the tech policies the president has emphasized. But even if all of those proposals were to become laws tomorrow, most of us speaking here today believe there'll still be significant gaps in the US government's ability to respond to fast-paced developments and harms of new technologies. This is something that CAP addressed at length in our 2021 report, How to Regulate Tech, a technology policy framework for online services, that I co-authored with my then colleague, Aaron Simpson. CAP called for expanded federal authorities to allow for ex ante or proactive rulemaking powers to curb technology problems before they occur, in addition to calling for higher requirements for online gatekeepers, a special online infrastructure regulatory tier, and rules for all online services, anchored in principles and prohibitions that prioritize civil rights and innovation, among other things. We noted such expanded authorities could live under an existing agency or a new one. The need for these ex-ante rulemaking powers to address the harms of technology is one that we will be discussing extensively today. Such rules are a key part of the EU's DSA and DMA, and even today, here at home, the Biden-Harris administration announced their long-awaited national cybersecurity strategy, which calls for the first time for new cybersecurity regulations to secure critical infrastructure to support national security and public safety. It is against this backdrop that we are excited to discuss the needed next wave of new technology regulation with some of the leading thinkers on the panel on the issue. Our panelists today include Tom Wheeler, the former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, a visiting fellow in governance studies at the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution, the author of From Gutenberg to Google, History of Our Future, and co-author of the paper New Digital Realities, New Oversight Solutions in the US. Harold Feld is the Senior Vice President at Public Knowledge, an expert on the intersection of technology, broadband, and media policy, and the author of the Case for the Digital Platform Act, which I believe has an introduction from Tom. And finally, Anna Leonard is a policy fellow at the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, or IDDP, at the George Washington University. Alum, and was most recently a senior policy advisor to Representative Lori Trahan, and before that, a Tech Congress Congressional Innovation Fellow with the House Antitrust Subcommittee during the digital markets investigation. Please welcome all our panelists. Thank you all for joining us. I want to start with you, Tom, because you've written extensively on a variety of subjects, including your proposal for a new digital regulator. But I know when we last spoke, you were very keen to really keep the focus first on the why of why we needed to take action on technology regulation, as opposed to getting in the weeds too much on the what of certain proposals. So I want to kick it to you to start with your big picture thoughts on why. Why is there a need for new technology regulation, and why is this moment so important?
Well, thank you, Adam, and thank you to CAP for bringing this group together. And it's a privilege to be up here with Anna and Harold and you. I do need to warn you, however, that you have just violated federal trademark law. You don't realize that alma mater, the Ohio State University, trademarked the word "the," and I'm going to feel constrained to use whatever regulatory resources there might be to report you.
Well, I will say, as a member of the Board of Trustees of the George Washington University, we are chartered federally by Congress. So the only way we can change our name is through a bill that passes through the House and the Senate. So that's a high bar, and we'll have to keep that in mind.
Touché. Yeah. So to get serious here for a second, I don't think they came for a comedy show. Look. Why do we need to have a technology regulator now? We've done such a good job thus far, haven't we? It's only been a couple of decades that we've been living with the new digital reality and its impact on privacy, destroying privacy rights and exposing young people. Competition, destroying competition and creating winner-take-all environments. And then there's a small issue with the truth and the impact this has had, the technology's had on the truth. And that's what's in front of us right now. That's what's been staring at us for the last multiple years, and it hasn't gotten any better. And now we get the metaverse and ChatGPT and augmented AI, which are going to do nothing but exacerbate the aforementioned problems. So it is time that we step up and put in place some kind of ongoing oversight that needs to be as agile as the digital companies themselves to be able to deal with the things that are coming. And I have recently become a believer in the concept that we have to change to preserve. Now, those two words seem to be opposites. But if we're going to preserve concepts like privacy, competition, and truth, we have to change the way we, the people, go about that. And that means that we need to have somebody at the federal level who wakes up every morning and says, what am I doing to keep pace with the changes and to make sure that the public interest is injected into all of these terrific technological changes and the corporate interests that they enable.
Thank you, Tom. I think that really frames the why in an important way. Harold, I think you're somebody who's thought about a lot about the why, but also the what. You know, your book, The Case for the Digital Platform Act, was published in 2019, and I think was the first to really make the strong case for a sector-specific digital regulator steeped in the public interest. Can you talk a little bit about that what and that why, and why you thought the sector-specific regulator was the right way to address that?
Sure. This on? Is this the okay? Good. Master of technologies, you see. But yes, first of all, I agree with everything that Tom just said, and I often come back in my mind to a statement that Tom made when at the FCC meeting, when asked why it was important to reclassify broadband as Title II, and he said, the internet has become too important in our lives to just leave to the companies. And that's not just true of the physical layer now. As we move up and more of our life takes place online in a way that we don't even think about. I mean, never mind the metaverse or being engrossed in, TikTok for hours. You can't apply for unemployment in some states without a broadband connection. You can't get federal aid in a emergency without a broadband connection. And if anybody doubted the importance of a broadband connection, we saw this in the pandemic. But it's not just the physical broadband, it's what we do online that's so critically important. So looking at this and thinking about this in 2019, I was like, okay, so historically, when have we needed a new agency? Because, it's not something you do lightly. So first thing is it really recognizable as a distinct sector of the economy? Yeah. So banking, we understand, banking and finance, you can say, sure, everybody uses money, but there are certain institutions we know are banks. The other issue that goes to it is it important in our lives? And at this point, yeah, it's clearly important in our lives. And then is it something that makes it hard for people to defend themselves? With Food and Drug Administration, for example, it's like, yeah, we can't expect people to test their own food or drugs to make sure they're safe. With the Securities and Exchange Commission, it was like, yeah, the finance stuff is so complicated and there's so many ways to hide the ball and do wrong. And when that happens, you're going to have a financial collapse. So we need a specialized expert regulator. Looking at the online space and the digital platform space, as Justice Kagan joked, we're not the 9 most expert folks about the internet, talking about the Supreme Court in Section 230. And Congress, while they can set things up and can do things like the Cicilline report, which was incredible about one particular aspect of the problems that are out there, you need a standing regulatory agency that can acquire the expertise that's necessary, that can be there as the expert, and as the expert can look over the shoulder of the industry and say, yeah, that's fine, keep doing that, that's good. Or even, we want to see more of that, let's create some incentives to do more of that. But also, that's not something you ought to be doing, or you really ought to be doing something about the way people are exploiting these things. And that's where we need an agency, and why just a one-off law, like, some of the improvements to the antitrust laws, those are great for solving a specific problem. But for the complicated, the difficult, the long-standing, you need an expert agency that's going to be able to stay on top of things.
You mentioned the House antitrust work done in the last two Congresses, and Anna, you were there and had a front row seat, and then later with Congresswoman Trahan, you really saw, I think, a lot of the efforts to regulate tech on antitrust and privacy and transparency. Can you talk a little bit about your recent experience on the Hill and how you think about prospects for new tech regulation right now in the United States?
Yeah, there's a lot to say about prospects. I think it's helpful to actually just start with what did get accomplished over the last 3 years. So 2 big things. First, huge narrative shifts from the minute I walked in early 2020 to when I left, right? If you look at and talk to members of Congress now, they all know tech policy is a space they have to pay attention to. Pretty much everyone on Capitol Hill has come to the conclusion that self-regulation is not going to work. And I know that narrative shift is in part to a lot of people in this room right now who did that work. So I just personally want to thank you as a Hill staffer. Like you do help us. You do make our lives easier. Thank you. But what came out of that narrative shift? A lot of text. So when I arrived in Congress, we had some privacy bills floating around. We had a lot of Section 230 reform ideas floating around. But what you saw, especially in these last 2 to 3 years, of course, the antitrust package, but also a big shift in how we think about these technologies as products. And how can we bring sort of a product safety lens to these ideas? How can we think about the design, the safety practices they're putting in place? How can we think about disclosures and the role disclosures could play? So you saw a lot of new proposals that include some of these concepts. The challenge is, as you start to think about those concepts, and even things as big as the Digital Services Oversight and Safety Act, which is a 90-page bill I worked on in Congresswoman Trahan's office, but also my friends in Senator Bennett's office and Representative Welch's office who were working on the new agency. It's really exciting. You're working for this really visionary member of Congress, but also our job is to wake up in the morning and to read the press in the tech policy space. And what did we see? We saw SCOTUS going after rulemaking, a very, very important tool in these pieces of legislation if we're going to keep up with tech. We saw First Amendment analysis claiming that maybe transparency reporting won't hold up, including ad libraries. Right? We're seeing Fourth Amendment analysis, Fifth Amendment analysis of things like researcher access to social media data. And look, you don't get to ignore that when you work on the Hill. We work for members who take an oath to the Constitution. And I do believe that the legislative branch has a role in putting out text that pushes precedent. But there's a line, they don't get to write bills that are just unconstitutional, or at least that's not a good idea, in my opinion. And so we don't get to ignore those forces. Additionally, when we write these bills, we send them out for technical assistance from the executive branch. And 9 times out of 10, what do the agencies come back with? We need resources, right? We need money, we need people. And the FTC, they're hiring 20 technologists right now. That's great, it's exciting. That is not enough to do the rulemaking that is outlined in ADPA, the privacy bill, in DeSosa, the transparency bills, in PATA, in PACTA. We could go on and on, right? So what does that mean for me? I'm excited about these ideas, very excited, and these two, obviously, incredibly influential in my life. But the road just gets longer and longer and longer because we haven't even talked about getting these proposals to the president's desk. I'm just gonna skip that for right now. But imagine you get them there. There's these there's this capacity building we still have to do. And then there's these legal cases that we have to pass through. But I don't want to end on that note. So I do want to end a little bit positive. One of the benefits that I have working on tech policy compared to my colleagues who work on healthcare and education is that the internet's borders are squishy. They're squishy. And that means we can use the states, we can look to Europe, and we can start to think about how we're going to speed up this timeline. We're already seeing it, right? The net choice case is going to give us some precedent around transparency reports, right? And we're going to be able to build off of that. I hope it's good to all of you writing amicus briefs. Please, please, please protect transparency requirements. But so that's really where I'm at now, is looking to the states, looking to Europe, thinking about what are some core pieces we can bring over.
I want to tease out one part of that because I think the audience is going to hear a lot about Europe and also what the United Kingdom is doing, today, and contrasting with what we've been thinking about. Can you talk a little bit, just maybe give a quick overview to some of the folks in the audience about the DSA and DMA, why they're important? Because again, I think we're going to hear of them over and over again today.
Absolutely love to. And I think the easiest way to talk about this is to actually think about the proposals and policies in the DMA and DSA.
You might also want to say what DMA and DSA stand for, because I
will.
don't think we did.
Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. But the first thing to acknowledge is a lot of the ideas in there are floating around in the US Congress too. So getting back to my comment about text, we have a lot of text. So the Digital Markets Act is most comparable to kind of the antitrust package, if you will. So first, it defines a set of gatekeepers based on their size, annual revenue, market cap. Shocker, it's Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, and a few others might slip in there. There's still some discussion. And essentially it outlines things that they have to do. So they have to offer interoperability, which is not too dissimilar from the Access Act here in the US. If they're in the ad tech stack, they have to make data available from the publishers to the advertisers and open up some of the data in real-time bidding. We have some similar provisions in the Senator Lee and Senator Klobuchar bill around that. And then when you go to the don't, what they are not allowed to do, it looks pretty similar to the American Innovation and Choice Online Act. So it says they can't self-preference their own products, they can't have conditional access, they have to allow users to uninstall default apps, which is great. And so that's the Digital Markets Act. And then if we switch to the Digital Services Act for a second, this one's a little bit trickier. The House has the Digital Services Oversight and Safety Act, against the bill I worked on, that takes a lot of the transparency requirement pieces from the DSA. And then if you squint really hard in the Senate, there's the PACT Act, which is led by Senator Thune and Senator Schatz. And there's PATA, which is led by Senator Coons and Senator Cassidy. Did I screw that up? Senator Thune and Senator Schatz. Okay, sorry. Oh, we're on PACT Act. So if you put those two together and squint, you see the DSA. And so what is the DSA? It is this answer to this question of, if you have a platform that hosts user-generated content, what are they responsible for? And the Digital Services Act is answering that with this very, 500, 600 page document. And they're basically saying, if you host user-generated content, you have to have clear transparency and clear terms of service. You also have to report illegal conduct, things of this nature. But where it really gets interesting is if you're a very large online platform. So if you're a host of user-generated content and you disseminate it, so a social media platform, basically, and you're of a certain size, you're going to have to do risk assessments and risk mitigation practices. Those will be audited. And then you also have to offer researcher access. So again, all of those provisions are sort of floating around in the US Congress too. But before I hand it off, I think what's really interesting is the way the European Commission plans to have oversight of these two bills. So they're actually planning to expand their powers at the European Commission level, so at this sort of multinational level. And they're going to have additional investigatory powers, abilities to do sanctions, and they're going to be able to look at VLOPs and gatekeepers together. So really taking a company like Google and looking at not just how are you protecting consumers on your platform, but how are you impacting competition? And I know that's something both of these men have written a lot about, being able to look at those data practices from both of those views at one regulator.
Thank you. And I think I speak for everyone for you're appreciating the conciseness of that very large laws to be explained. So I want to throw the conversation open a little bit to everyone here to talk. We're going to contrast what's happening in the EU and the UK, but that also those are reality. These are laws that are being complied with. We know that companies are building the necessary technology to make sure they can comply with it in a similar way that they had to build privacy technology to comply with GDPR. We know that companies are moving staff to Europe to kind of comply with it. How should we be thinking about this moment for the United States compared to what others are doing? And how do you see the kind of next few years unfolding in both what will happen and what we'd like to happen? And I'll throw that open to all of the panelists. Just leave it on, Harold.
There we go. Okay. I think that it's very important for us to do two things. One is we're seeing real life experiments happening. And, the folks in the EU have been very clear that this is an iterative process. They learned from the privacy general directive on whatever GDPR stands for. That's the problem here. You get too into the acronyms, but they learned from that experience, which is one of the reasons why they changed the structure to have the largest of these regulated directly by the European Council rather than through the member states. This is in some ways their first experiment with federalism. It'll be very interesting to watch and see if this works. It's a approach that's really more similar to what you do in banking and finance in terms of risk assessment than what we've been thinking of in the United States in terms of direct behavioral rules. So there's a lot that's going on there that's interesting. There's another real-time experiment going on in the UK on how well can different government agencies coordinate to have a coherent policy that moves in a consumer-centered direction. That'll be another. But we need to remember that we have our own set of values, our own set of concerns, and we have our own history. We also have our own court system and and our own federalism. So we cannot simply rely on what others are doing. We shouldn't rely on what others are doing. There are some things we should do, which is recognize that when people panic talk about how this will kill innovation and you can't do it and it's too hard to regulate, we should recognize that, they said the same thing over in Europe, and now there are big companies setting up offices in Brussels to make sure that they comply and follow the law. So you can do it. And I think that we need to assume that we are going to get there, and that we will learn from what everybody else is doing, but what we will do will be what we feel is right for the United States to protect the citizens of the United States, the people of the United States, and the businesses of the United States economy. Doesn't mean we ignore the rest of the world, but this has to be, our efforts have to be what regulate here and not simply rely on the regulatory machinery of others.
Well, I agree with what Harold said, maybe take a slightly orthogonal view. The internet was invented in this country. The major players are in this country. Every single one of the major technical components in this device originated in this country with the support of the United States government. And we're about to become second stringers on establishing the policy for all of this brave new world that we pioneered. That hooray for the EU and what they're doing. Am I a fan of the DMA and the DSA? You bet. Hooray for the UK in what they're doing. But the tragedy, and I think that's the word, the tragedy is that, as Harold said, these are great allies. These are liberal democracies. These are marketplace economies, but they do have different values. And they do have their own companies that they'd like to see succeed in the market. And so with them becoming the leaders, because we defaulted on leadership, is the situation we find ourselves in today. And my concern, and I'd look to Anna to really react, tell me if I'm full of it or not, but my concern is that the Congress of the United States is going to get around to doing something eventually. And by the time they get around to doing something, the companies will be realizing the importance of accepting that rather than fighting it. And the quick and easy answer will be, well, hey, they're doing this over there. Let's just make that a rule here too. And we will have lost American leadership in a space that America developed.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I do think that's probably what's going to happen. I think where maybe you and I disagree a little bit is I maybe don't think it's the end of the world. And let me explain that for a second. So Susan Ness was supposed to be here. I'm in her spot. I hope she's feeling better. But I've been working with her over the last year or so, and she has this idea, this concept of modularity. And this idea is, you know, she's looking around at these laws all over the world, mostly Europe, and looking at some of these core concepts that really would make sense here in the United States as like a core hub to work off of. So let me back up for a second. When I was working in Congress, what you start to realize, especially in a House personal office where you're working on a lot of issues, is one, what everyone in this room already knows, this country is missing core data rights. Like our citizens don't have core data rights. We also don't have a central location where there's great frameworks and protocols and standards. NIST is making some progress and that's awesome, but it doesn't have teeth. So we're missing that. But also what I see is a lot of our agencies are becoming digital regulators in their various ways. So I'll use FDA as an example because I've been watching them quite closely. More and more medical devices have AI in them, or automated decision systems, if we're being real here, in them. And look, you know, the FDA makes sure that devices are safe before they go to the market. They've been doing that for a long time. But right now, if you're a company and you have a medical device, you don't have to test it for disparate impact. You don't have to test that it works the same for people with dark skin versus people with light skin. They're doing some guidance documents on this, and there's an executive order, but it's not mandated. You don't have to do those impact assessments. And so the FDA is sitting there sort of like, ooh, what do we do here? What's considered safe? And they don't have core guidelines or core mandated assessments to pull from. But Europe is right now pinned to papering some of these things. They're pinned to papering risk assessments. They're pinned to papering researcher access to social media data protocols, ways for auditors to get access. And we could preemptively get to the table and start to think about what of these pieces can be quote unquote modules that we can sort of use multilateral agreements or foreign affairs to sort of get to the help shape the first drafts, and then later think about what is the US context, what might need to change as we bring them over here. So I think there's a way to sort of
Susan's
Yeah.
modularity concept is terrific.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. Can I pick up on one thing that Anna just said that's really important, because she's now said it twice, which is risk assessment. We can learn, as Anna just suggested, we can learn from what's going on abroad, because the style of our regulation in this country tends to be an import from the industrial era, which was top-down micromanagement. And in the digital era, what we need to be doing is going back to basics, such as the common law duty of care, which says that you have a responsibility to identify harmful issues that could result from your product and mitigate them. Okay. And what both the EU and the UK have done is, instead of having this kind of top-down micromanagement, begin their process with risk assessment. What are the risks? And let's work with the companies to identify those, and let's argue and fight and go back and forth like mad to identify what those are. And then what's the best way to mitigate them? And that is a module, for instance, that is worth our importing over here to think about how we break out of industrial era concepts to face the digital reality.
I just want to push back on that quick, and I know we're squeezed on time, but I think that's a place to start. But I need to point out that a lot of the good that we have from policy and the good that we have from forward-looking regulation is not simply risk assessment and risk management. And since industrial policy is starting to come back again and be cool again, and we don't have to be ashamed of it, I will say, yeah, there have been times when we have said we need to lead with industrial policy. We would never have these cell phones if the United States hadn't said, hey, we're going to do spectrum auctions and we're going to totally break the mold on how we do wireless policy, not because we're going to rely on the major telephone companies to do a risk assessment about what they might do, and not because they were particularly innovative, but because we've got to be the ones that break the mold so that stuff can happen. So risk assessment is good, and what they're doing now, and being focused on consumer protection, things are good, but sometimes you need a regulator that can overturn the apple cart and give folks a kick in the pants when they need it.
Thank you. And we're about to go to questions, but Tom, I do want to pick up on one thing you said before we go to Q&A from the audience. We've talked a lot about the need for expertise, for new sector-specific regulators, and you are the former chairman of the FCC, which is a sector-specific regulator. So I do want to note in your paper, you proposed a new digital platform agency that you said should have kind of digital DNA. And I know you don't want to dwell too much on the what, but I do think a second or two on why you think a new agency with new digital DNA would be important in this kind of moment.
It's an amazing experience trying to administer an agency in the 21st century digital environment whose statute and structures were built in 1934 around basic radio and telephony. We need to have the ability to focus on the issue of today, the issues of today, not the way we structured things previously. I was at a conference like this with Madeleine Albright not too many years ago, rest her soul. And we were talking about the impact of technology on diplomacy. And she says, the problem with diplomacy is that we take 21st century challenges and define them in 20th century terms and propose 19th century solutions. And I leaned over and I said, Madam Secretary, I'm going to steal that. Because it is a great way of looking at things. And so what we need to be doing now is breaking the bonds that, I am all for Lena Khan and the FTC and what she's doing. I'm all for the leadership in the FCC. These are important kinds of things that we ought to be supporting, but they bring with them a muscle memory. This is how we've always operated. The staff thinks that way. The commissioners think that way. The Congress people who oversee it think that way. The practitioners think that way. The judges think that way. It is time to say, time out. Let's not bolt on. Let's do something original, kind of like what Harold was saying.
Perfect. Well, with that, let's go to some questions from the audience or online. And
our first question is from our online audience. Digital platforms like Google and Apple have claimed without evidence that antitrust legislation or enforcement would harm innovation or U.S. economic competitiveness. In reality, some of these companies are investing heavily in countries like China. How should policymakers view digital platforms' self-serving claims about unintended consequences of tech regulation? How should they separate claims that have merit from scaremongering?
I believe Tom has some thoughts on this.
I was going to actually, Anna, I was chuckling because the impact on innovation and investment is the first trope that is ever brought forward in any kind of argument. Oh my goodness, this is going to be terrible on innovation. This is going to quash investment. And the reality is that you innovate for competitive purposes. You don't innovate because, hey, I'm really big and I want to figure out something new. What you're doing with the fiduciary responsibility of somebody in that situation is to maintain their position, not to develop something threatening. And investment, look, you invest for return. Okay. And where does return come from? Return comes from innovation. It is not a decision that is, well, the regulators won't let me invest.
I'll just quickly add, I mean, one of the reasons I'm also excited about the progress in Europe, and I hate to be the person that's just like, yeah, Europe, is that as a Hill staffer, stakeholders of all types, the companies, but also public interest groups, they show up and they'll critique a piece of legislation and they'll give 3 or 4 bullet points. And sometimes they sound really reasonable. Like some of the arguments sound kind of reasonable. And if you're lucky, you have a couple hours that you can dig in and find out if it's real, or you have someone at Public Knowledge you can call up and be like, is this true? But we have a lot to do. We did a lot last Congress. And so I think what's really exciting is that Europe is gonna they're not gonna be able to use all those talking points anymore, right? Because they're gonna be doing it and we're gonna see some of the outcomes. And so, yes, I wish we were, look, I worked on a lot of bills. I give a lot of weekends. I wish they had passed, but I am excited to see that some of our trading partners are gonna be able to take away some of these talking points.
Perfect. Question from the audience. I think Josh has the microphone.
Please say your name and affiliation first, please.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Michelle Maldonado. I'm a delegate with the House of Delegates in Virginia. And I helped co-found our Technology and Innovation Caucus. As a recovering tech attorney, I am feeling like this is a tall drink of water, what we're having this conversation here. And the question I have for you, I agree with the comments that were made today. We are not just dealing with avoiding this predisposition to take what people have done in other places and plop it here in the US, but we're also looking at that across states. What works in one state may not work in another, so the same analysis has to be done. And I think that we have to do it with the disparate impact balanced with opportunity and innovation and competitiveness upfront, right? I tell people the technology moves at the speed of light and legislation and policy moves at the speed of molasses. So how do we bring them together? So the question I have is with so many people not really understanding the technical space and even the fear mongering and the misinformation, I believe that these bite-sized chunkable pieces that apply and are applicable across different states and commonwealths are going to be an important way to increase education and buy-in. And I think you also reference this, and I'm curious if you have some thoughts around what you think the common core pieces are that are necessary for us to start with at the state level as we await more streamlined, consistent guidance and legislation from the federal level. Thank you.
Well, first of all, even though public knowledge is primarily about federal advocacy, one of the things we're very big on is no preemption or minimizing preemption. Because what goes on in the states is important and it is a driver. The fact is that we would not have seen members of Congress suddenly coming together around the privacy bill if California hadn't been out there creating a real privacy bill, not perfect. And, we'll all learn from what happens there. And then, there have been other states. So I think that the role of states is important here. And yeah, but states don't have the same resources as the federal government. There are places where we need to have uniform policy. Sometimes, what looks good in one state may look atrocious elsewhere. See the latest bill in the Texas legislature to require ISPs to block any platform that provides access to abortion pills or information about safe abortion. So, there are going to be some value judgments that we're going to have to make at a national level, as we always have. So I guess that's a long way of saying states, keep on stating, keep on doing this stuff, both to inform, policy generally and to drive the federal government to actually do stuff.
And I know we're coming up on time, so I do want to say thank you for all you're doing in the House Delegates. I think, some of the work the Biden-Harris administration has done is going to be implementing through the Infrastructure Reduction Act, through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, through the CHIPS work, has a real component of geographic equity, of making sure that we are taking that into account in a way we haven't historically done with real money that is flowing through the states. And so I know that'll be both a tremendous challenge and opportunity for that implementation. And I know certainly we're hearing it from a great Virginian and Chris Lewis as we close today. I want to be so conscious of time. We've got Dr. Nelson coming up next. So a last closing thought from all of you. We talked a lot about dominant digital platforms. We've talked a lot about what kind of dominates the news today, but we know challenges are still coming with things like ChatGPT. A quick closing thought on how we should be addressing that before we leave the stage from each of you.
Well, on ChatGPT general specifically, or because one of the things that I want to make a last point is we focus a lot on the big platforms, but it's not just about the big platforms. I like to tell people, you don't feel any better when you're ripped off by a small platform rather than a big platform. So while I understand that what drives things is it's very easy to see Amazon is killing small businesses, or, Google controls 90% of the ad space, or any of these things. But, it's not like small platforms are necessarily harmless, as well as being positive sources of innovation. So one of the advantages of an agency is you can give it sector authority and not just limit this to today's challenges or today's biggest platforms.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly add, very similar to what you're saying, we have to center around core data rights and core human rights. And I'm still reflecting on ChatGPT, but for me, what is the core human and data right we're concerned about? And for me, it's human autonomy, right? I mean, it's so powerful. It can manipulate the people it is chatting with to maybe leave their wife, which is a critical off-screen decision, right? And so then the question becomes, okay, if we have a regulator that's well-staffed, that's centered around human and data rights, they can start thinking about the context in which large language models might make sense and where we want to draw some bright lines. And I think we need to be honest about drawing some bright lines. I would like HHS to draw some bright lines around ChatGPT being used in therapy, for example, right?
So I think it's important. Well, a couple of months ago, if we'd had this, everybody's hair would have been on fire about the metaverse. Right now, everybody's hair except Chris Lewis's hair is on fire about ChatGPT. I mean, the reality is that ChatGPT is not a great technological breakthrough. It's like email in terms of the processing involved, but it is a breakthrough in expressing the technology. The initial technology is never what is transformative. It is always the secondary applications of it, which I think what Anna was just saying. And so we need to be focusing on those secondary applications, not get hung up on today it's the metaverse, or today it's ChatGPT, yesterday was the metaverse. It's what's the effect of those, and to have that kind of analysis of effect and doing something about it, we need to have a structure in our federal government that is as agile as those who are creating the technologies in the first place.
Well, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. And let's give our panelists a round of applause. And now Mara Rudman will be heading us.
Hello, everyone. Yes, working? Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. I'll just hope. I'm Mara Rudman. I'm the Executive Vice President Policy here at Center for American Progress. And I am very excited for a number of reasons to introduce to you your next speaker, who also I am welcoming to the Center for American Progress, not just as a speaker. We obviously appreciate all of you as speakers and the wonderful panelists we had, but Dr. Alondra Nelson is joining us officially as of today as a Distinguished Senior Fellow here at American Progress. So we are absolutely thrilled to have her, and her background and her expertise and her know-how and her visions of looking at the world and a number of complex issues. As many of you know, Dr. Nelson just recently concluded her important service leading the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. She has deep research and policy expertise, and she's going to be working with us here at American Progress on some of the topics today, but putting in a broader context. And I'm sure some of her comments will go into that. But we really feel that it's critical to be able to explore and drive forward policy around the interconnections between science and data and economies and equity and justice and democracy. And particularly so at this unique moment of profound technological change, as we've been talking about. Dr. Nelson is a pioneer in bringing together what have long been viewed as disparate threads across these issues. She will help us here at American Progress to sharpen our vision in the ways in which science and technology policy offer architecture and infrastructure to build a better, stronger union. So please join me in a warm welcome to Dr. Alondra Nelson for her remarks today, which also will mark what we hope will be the first of many public engagements with us here at CAP in this new role. Dr. Nelson, welcome.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for that great panel. And I look forward to having more conversation with Harold and Tom and Anna. I am really delighted to be here, to be joining the Center for American Progress community, precisely because CAP has been, as you saw today in this rich conversation, a place for asking really hard questions and a place where you can sort of incubate and catalyze, I think, bold policy solutions that move from ideation to improving people's lives and to a more equitable society, which is really what's at stake for all of us here. So as Mara suggested, I do approach this from a slightly broader angle. I think, science and technology obviously matter across every policy set. And so while today's conversation has been very much about social media and about a really important sort of pillar of US society and US policymaking, the sort of tech pillar, we really need to also think about, as Maura and I think Tom we're getting to at the end, the use cases, the places where these sciences and technologies sit. So I'm looking forward to working across CAP's teams to really identify opportunities for policy impact. So the conversation today really exemplified what's been clear to many of us here in this room, as well as many of us who've had the great honor of working in the Biden-Harris administration. First, the really profound need for a forward-leaning, comprehensive policy strategy for the technology ecosystem, like for social media and well beyond, given the wide range of both pressing and emergent issues that we face. We need to use every tool at our disposal. And so I was struck by we can talk about this later, but I was struck in the panel with, Tom, Anna, and Harold sort of saying, well, it's not only regulation, but we need a new entity and we also need this. We need all of it. I mean, I think that to Tom's point about how long we have been fairly feckless and moving the needle on this. It's a time for kind of all hands on deck and very much a proponent of using every possible lever and tool that we have and using them together and at the same time. Second, we clearly need policy innovation and how we imagine, develop, and use this variety of levers and tools at our disposal to give shape to a fair and just society. Tom has used Agile. I like to think about the dynamic space of the technology. It compels us to use, I think, transportation metaphors like building the plane as we fly. It's also the case that we're making rules for the road when the road itself is undergoing constant paving, or it's constant resurfacing, that the dynamism is taking place on parallel roadways with different velocities. That's the policy space. And I think to Tom's point, it is not just the 21st century worth the 20th. I think even in the 21st century, there are policy spaces in which the thing that we are trying to make policy around is fairly static. And this is a constantly evolving dynamic space. And it really requires us, I think, to think about wholesale policymaking and regulation completely anew. So this, for me, I think, is the challenge of the next wave of not just regulation, but of policymaking, which is regulation plus in this broader ecosystem. How do we govern, regulate, and democratize in the context of this dynamism? So one key answer that we were coming to at the end of the panel, I was really encouraged to hear in the midst of all of this dynamism, is to think about what we can hold constant. And we can hold values as a constant. This is where Anna was taking us at the end. Policymaking, after all, is an assertion of values of the good society that we hope to live in. The president's going to release his budget tomorrow, and probably as he did last year, he will say that the budget is a social compact. It's assertion of our values. It's a statement of values. Similarly, Harold and his case for the Digital Platform Act reminded us, and I'm quoting him here, that the objective of regulation is to achieve particular social goals that express our values as a society. So what are some of these values? Belief in democracy, as we discussed, a society that does not leave people, their perspectives, and their livelihoods behind as it becomes more reliant on expertise and more technologically mediated. We value a society that has space for people and communities to have a voice and a role in the consequential decisions about their lives, even as those become more technically complicated or scientifically abstract. Such values are manifest in the Biden-Harris administration's tech accountability agenda, which was reasserted by the president in his most recent State of the Union address, which Adam referenced in his introduction. These include privacy, especially for young people, freedom from algorithmic discrimination, which has not come up in the conversation today, and I want to highlight and lift up, competition. These values can be mobilized in an innovative way of thinking about standards and risks. So we've talked a little bit about NIST and the risk assessment framework. Points taken, I think, about risk assessment as not the thing that's really going to move the lever for us. But I think what's really important about what NIST has accomplished here, and maybe different from our EU colleagues, is that they understand this to be a version 1.0, that it's an iterative tool, and that is intended to be a socio-technical tool. And so NIST is specifically saying, we are an organization that for 2 centuries nearly has been working on standards, and that we're now, to Tom's point, in a moment in the 21st century, and when these standards need to have a kind of agility, that we're going to come back and they're going to be iterative. There'll be a 2.0 and a 3.0, and that we're thinking of standards just not as technical, static things, but as socio-technical things that exist in a kind of dynamism with the world around them. So these values can be embodied as principles and mobilized as practices that can be marshaled in the design stage and after products are released. So both mitigating early on and hoping to remedy harms on the back end. This is what we tried to accomplish with the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights, which the president referenced in his January op-ed. These values can be embedded and empowered with a new independent federal agency, like perhaps what Harold and Tom have been suggesting in their compelling arguments. But I also think it's the case that to meet this moment, that we need to match the vitality of American science, technology, and innovation with humane, imaginative, and equitable policy direction. And that means that I think that we need to stipulate and be really honest about the fact, Delegate Maldonado said, speed of lightning and molasses, that is just the truism of where we live. And so our policymaking is never going to be fast enough for the innovation. And that means that our policymaking needs to not be about the objects or the technologies, it needs to be about the values, and it needs to be about the society that we want to have. And moreover, part of what we admire about US innovation and about US science, technology, ingenuity is the fact that it does, as the president would say, make impossible things possible, right? And so we're never going to be in the regulatory or policymaking space, I think, able to sort of be thinking one step ahead of the innovation space. And that's okay, but that means that we need to have a sort of new model for the way that we think about policymaking. It also means, importantly, not making the mistake of assuming that every new development in technology or science, generative AI, for example, which we talked about, means that we have to make the social compact anew. And I think a lot of our work in the policymaking space has been exactly that. We have a new, I often use the, for those of us who are around my age or older, the sort of Lucille Ball conveyor belt. Like there's a new technology coming off the conveyor belt. She's trying to keep up with these new things coming off the conveyor belt. And we're trying to do policy that sort of keep up with that. And we simply cannot. And so, but the good thing is that we don't have to, right? Because we have a Bill of Rights and we have a constitution and we have existing regulations and rules of the road that we can use creatively, even in moments when 21st century technology is moving at break speed pace. So the fact sheet that accompanied the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights made clear that existing guidance regarding housing discrimination, fair employment, worker bargaining rights extend to automated systems, to automated decision-making systems, to AI systems, and to those who use them to shape access to resources, services, and opportunities. And so this is the kind of policy innovation, even as we are all, I think, waiting for that omnibus privacy bill that we can move forward with. The next wave of tech regulation, therefore, is not just about regulation. It's certainly not only about new regulation. It requires the use of existing norms, rights, standards, guidance, rulemaking, executive actions, and all more altogether. For example, in the exercise of existing agency powers, we saw that FTC signaled earlier this week and cautioning companies about fair advertising practices and reminding them that these rules apply even with automated systems, right? The blog post was titled "Keeping AI Claims in Check." So society is being transformed now, harms are happening now, and we have to act now. And we can act now using, as I said, every tool and lever to steer science and technology in a direction that supports our values and our priorities. We've got to think creatively about existing laws and regulations, even as we seek new regulation that's needed. The work ahead requires all of us. And I think as I'll sort of end as I began with saying to all of us here who are experts and technocrats variously, that we need to have communities at the table, that it's not only that we need to be thinking about the use cases and the outcomes, we need to be thinking about the people to whom those outcomes are happening and to who are experiencing those. So we need labor activists and civil rights leaders, as well as technologists, policymakers, entrepreneurs, state and federal legislators, community organizations, and more to play a role in building this future. And I hope that we can imagine a science and technology policy that puts people at the center and communities at the center as we try to have a vision for innovation that includes equity, that advances and strengthens democracy and secures a just future for us all. So I'm delighted to be able to join this community to begin the conversation. I look forward to many more conversations with Adam and Harold and Anna and Tom. I've heard Chris was described as the Great Virginian, and so I think it's now my duty to pass the mic to the Great Virginian, Chris Lewis, President of Public Knowledge.
It's very kind. Thank you. I am very proud of being from Virginia. Delegate Maldonado, I'm so glad you're here. But I do cross the river every day for my day job here at Public Knowledge, and just really excited and about the conversation we had here today. I'll be brief because I just want to first say thank you to Center for American Progress for partnering with us and hosting this in your wonderful facility. Adam, your leadership here has been fantastic, and really excited for where these ideas can go. And because we had such a smart panel and followed up by Dr. Nelson and all the great work she's doing, I just want to leave you all with a quick thought. Our audience, both here in person and the folks who are watching online, of just the sort of thing that we have to do, because being a public interest advocate is often an exercise in daily optimism. We are Adam's smiling. We are outgunned. We don't have campaign contributions to give like other advocates in town. We probably don't have as many lobbyists running around town, but we believe that these things can be accomplished if we work carefully, if we work smart to make them happen, and if we keep lifting up the values that Dr. Nelson was talking about. So I just want the folks in the room here, and I know I see a lot of folks I know, not everyone fully agrees with maybe our position or Adam's paper or Tom's paper, but we clearly have an important job to do. I'm just reminded that good policy that puts the public good at the center of policymaking isn't just born, it's crafted. It's crafted over time, and it doesn't just happen with one magical bill or one magical congressional session, but it takes persistence. And so for the folks here in the room, the folks who deal in policy every day, I encourage you to fight against the urge of the city that we're working in today. Think about the folks that you're serving, and remember that they don't care as much about who's up or who's down, about whose nomination goes through or who doesn't. They care about whether the stuff is working for them. And they care about if they care about if the internet can be trusted. And they're going to take, and how do I know, let me just say, they're going to take what we give them through policy and through the development of the technology. And yes, the design is important as well, tech companies. They're going to take what they get and think that that's what is possible. So we have to work to broaden what is possible policy-wise so that we get something that they can trust. I just flew in from San Antonio where I was at the National Digital Inclusion Alliance Conference. Some of you guys know who that is. A great organization that just working on broadband policy is has people on the ground in every state helping average citizens learn how to connect to the internet, learn how to take advantage of things that were crafted in policy to make sure everyone was connected to the internet. Subsidies like the Affordable Connectivity Fund. These folks are doing the hard work on the ground, making what we talk about every day in here DC possible for folks to use what is, for my money, the most democratizing communications tool ever created. So when we talk about values, Dr. Nelson talked about ones I list. We have to center those in our work because those people are counting on us. And then hopefully some of them are watching. And so I just encourage, if you are watching, or if you're like us, a civil society group, we have to find ways to make sure that those folks are brought to the table. There's a variety of ways to connect people to the policy conversation. Some were involved in public knowledge, some were not, but I believe that there's something growing that is not organized, but is a movement to build a better internet. We have a website called Movement for a Better Internet. You can check it out. Or you can go to other groups that aren't on that website that are helping people figure out what policy should look like. Because as smart as this panel was, being the smartest in the room isn't always what makes good policy. You've got to get those voices to the table so they can tell you how it impacts their lives. So, you know, CAP has CAP Action. Plug for CAP Action. Join CAP Action. Grassroots organizing. You know, groups like Media Justice and Free Press on the ground who sit at the table with industry. So this is how we get this accomplished. I'm optimistic that we can do it, but it takes persistence. It takes a willingness to, yes, pass a privacy bill, but then figure out what's next. Yes, create an agency, but then figure out how that agency works with fidelity to the values that we're talking about and isn't captured by industry. This is the work in front of us and it doesn't stop. So please, policy folks, make sure you're bringing voices to the table. Folks who are not involved in policy, find ways to plug in, you know, follow Public Knowledge, follow Center for American Progress, follow our peers. We're here to help make policy in the public interest. And I'm really excited for what's going to come. Hopefully we can get a congressional hearing about this topic, about creating a digital regulator and get something moving here, give people something to rally behind and get excited about. So Center for American Progress, Mara. Oh, where'd Mara go? Oh, okay. Well, then I'll turn it to Adam to close it out. I can close it out. I feel all the power up here. Well, then I'll just say thank you all for coming. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event here or at Public Knowledge, and have a great afternoon. Sam? Yeah. You'd like to just get up there.
I don't know if you're gonna.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your question.